Jinglewalla and welcome to Tales of the Tweed. My name is Arabella and I am here every Wednesday morning at 10:30 discussing an Aboriginal lens about the area and the environment in which we live. I have chosen over the next 4 weeks to share with you some stories about flooding and waterways in our area. Last week we discussed how you as an individual could feel empowered to respond against large-scale flooding. And the answer to that is simple. It's trees, multiple tree planting, native trees, radical tree planting, seeds in your pocket, walking around, us as a community deciding to replant trees on the riverbeds is the easiest and simplest solution to stopping excessive flooding that's occurring in the area. I'm going to share with you today some stories about ancient floods that are recorded in Aboriginal history from around the country. The reason that I'm sharing these stories with you is so that you understand that flood recording, which is what you might have heard about known as the BOM system, when people kind of predict how floods impact, how quickly they're running, what the likelihood of evacuation is, etc. That system is just based on data. So it basically means that since people started mapping floods, all of those characteristics and the data around how floods behave, where they come from, how they move across the country are all put into a super large computer, and the computer does predictions on what a flood's impact is based on the velocity of the flow of water, the temperature, the season, the rain velocity, the size of the river systems that have been impacted previously, and all of that data is correlated to give us warnings and indication about whether or not we need to evacuate outside of a flood rushing in quickly, or whether or not we should remain in our homes. And that's the system that all emergency services rely upon. So that system has to pick up information from the ground, put it into a large storage brain of historical information that kind of started being compiled around 1788 or just after that, really in the early 1800s. And then making predictions on what we now know as phrases like a 100-year flood or a 50-year flood. Now, effectively, most of that information is really redundant because the analysis for that fails to take into account climate impact and the behaviour we have as human beings on the environment. So if the behaviour of the environment was to remain stable and we weren't going to be polluters, potentially we would have a system of maybe a 100-year flood or 50-year flood. But because we have decided that we want to use fuels in our cars and live a dangerous, environmentally damaging life, we are also going to be the victims of that impact, which means that the prediction of those floods is going to be less accurate, and you need better data to put inside the BOM data calculations to actually have more accurate information about what actually impacts the continent known as Australia. And one way to improve how we understand our environment is to actually look at First Nations people, record their history more intelligently into a system of prediction so that we can both encourage ourselves to have some sense of security around water, but also we can predict with better accuracy whether or not these things are in fact a result of a 100-year flood, 50-year flood, or something else that is going on. I am going to share with you today on this program some stories from around Australia which speak of major flooding occurring and changing the shape of the continent. One is a story from the Gulf of Carpentaria, where the mobs from the Gulf of Carpentaria, the Garigu women and men, record a story of how their homeland islands were not islands as they are today. They were part of a peninsula that just jutted out from the mainland, where they roamed freely and then didn't have to get in a boat to access their own country. They tell this story through the tradition of storytelling. It's represented in art in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and it's an example of how large-scale flooding affected the continent and changed the shape that we consider it to be now. Those stories are often accompanied by stories of hunting animals like kangaroo and emu before the water rose and flooded them. And again, the water never receded. So the water changed the shape of the Gulf of Carpentaria. The ocean comes in, it rises. That is recorded, and that story then is handed down and handed along so that people still repeat it. It's reflected in art in the area, and it's indicative of human observation or physical human observation about continental changes as floods have occurred on the continent. Several other mobs record stories in the same way in art and in storytelling, linguistically recording particular variations to land, where they lived on lands which now we know as the Great Barrier Reef. So for them, they have history of the Great Barrier Reef not existing, being dry, and people living on that land. The Yidinji people of the Cairns area recall a time when Fitzroy Island was part of the mainland and offshore Green Island was 4 times larger. The story describes several named landmarks and remembered historical and cultural associations which are now underwater. What we can be almost certain of is the people of this area did occupy the coast where the Great Barrier Reef now stands during the last ice age. And so they tell the story of broad floodplains and hills and a range of subsistent possibilities and steep cliffs plunging down to the narrow shore. Now the question is, when you contrast that to the Ice Age, you're really talking about a story, a conservative interpretation, is about 10,000 years ago. So what you have is oral history shared between person to person, generation to generation, carried forward, revealing to us that we experience change and large flooding and oceans rising, and they are examples of the shifts and the changes in the continental makeup of Australia. Similar stories are found in Spencer Gulf in southern Australia, the Ngara people of the York Peninsula. They also talk about having no Spencer Gulf, only marshy country reaching into the interior, lying just above the ocean surface and dotted with freshwater lagoons. So that completes part 1 of our series on ancient floods. Please join me next Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. 101.3 FM, where we will continue the series on ancient floods and talk about how ancient flood information can inform our resilience and recovery and response to current flooding. My name is Arabella, Bugabea, and see you next week.